Are you ready for good talk? And hello there, Peter Mansbridge here, along with Chantal Hébert and Bruce Anderson. Good to have everybody back after the holiday break. Chantal was overseas somewhere. It was Japan, was it not?
Mm-hmm.
Good time?
Yes, fewer Chinese tourists. They're having a bit of a fight over Taiwan. So
Yes.
Those tourism boycotts, they're not just uniquely Canadian, apparently.
That's true. And Bruce is here, obviously, and he's in Ottawa. So it's good to have the gang back together again. And there's lots to talk about this week. So let's get right at it. On, almost a week after the Americans move in on Venezuela and capture Maduro and make all kinds of statements, both at the time by Donald Trump, threatening not just the future of Venezuela, but other countries as well. Implicit in that seemed to be that any neighbor that stepped out of line in the Western Hemisphere would be a target for the U.S. And that kind of rhetoric has been carried on in the days since, which has left me, and I don't know whether I don't think I'm alone on this, but, maybe I'm overreacting, but I'm worried, I'm very worried about where Canada sits in all this and what his intentions are with Canada in the move forward. So I want your sense of that, whether either of you feel the same way. Let's start with Bruce. What are you thinking here?
Yeah, I'm very worried as well, Peter. I'm worried because it's become clearer, I think, than it ever has, what exactly is the range and extent of President Trump's ambitions. And I'm worried that so far anyway, the degree of resistance within the United States, whether among Republicans or Democrats or the other kind of institutions that can do some sort of counter weight, that level of resistance is really quite modest. The things that strike me in the roughly week, as you say, since the action in Venezuela.
It's funny, people are not sure how to actually describe it. Was it like the kidnapping of the president? Was it an invasion of Greenland? I mean, after all, he's taking over the oil fields, depending on what language you want to use.
Yeah, so the first instance, what we heard was that this was about, removing a brutal dictator and restoring freedom for Venezuelans. And we are hearing less and less about that in the ensuing days and more about the idea of America having a hemisphere. And within that hemisphere, the idea that America, because it has the biggest army, the most military force, should be able to and should exercise military force to take over whatever it wants, whether that's in Greenland, whether it's related to Cuba, potentially whether it's related to Canada. There's I wouldn't even call it a creep. There's a fairly rapid and obvious drift towards this idea that muscularity is a choice that's economically interesting to Americans and should be the thing that guides American foreign policy. We've never really heard anything like that in my lifetime. And the more recent version of it, I guess in the last 24, 48 hours has been, the president saying that we're going to operate Venezuela for the next several years. We're going to control the oil resources, and we're going to do that because we can, not because we're restoring freedom and prosperity for Venezuelans, but because we see it as being in our interests, and whatever we see as being in our interests is something that we feel perfectly entitled to do, and around which we don't feel that there are any possible repercussions that can be bad for Americans. There's a level of myopia in that and arrogance in that that is shocking, but it should be also, as you say, Peter, worrisome, because the destabilizing effect of America is saying, look, Russia, China, do whatever you want in your part of the world, some of which they're saying almost overtly, the other is kind of by implication. But we're going to do whatever we want in what we consider to be our part of the world. And of course, Canada is in that part of the world. So there's a new level of risk, a new level of destabilization. This is in many ways a much more significant crisis than the one that we thought we were facing last year, which is really about what seems almost kind of a simple matter of tariffs. But yeah, I'm worried like you are, Peter. I think this is a new and very dangerous kind of rhetoric coming from the White House and supported by far, far, far more Republicans than I thought would be either overtly or by acquiescence than I thought would be possible.
Where are you on this, Chantal?
Well, any delusion that the big deal in 2026 was going to be a trade renegotiation, I guess that's flown out the window very early in the year. Yes, Kuzma is really interesting, but that's not what we are into. I'm guessing that in the first 24 hours post Venezuela, whatever you want to call it, there was this delusion again that this would be about democracy and restoring the duly elected party to government in Venezuela. That's all gone now. I wonder, by the way, what the conservatives who were so prompt to applaud Maduro's demise are now thinking about their leaders, Pierre Poilievre's slogan, "Down with socialism, long live freedom." Yeah, really, that is, freedom is the opposite of what's been happening in Venezuela since then. Which brings us, and it goes in stages, and that is why I think there is absolutely no point in panicking, in the sense that this requires more deliberation and stability than panic buttons. So that brings us to Greenland. And why Greenland matters is because Denmark is part of NATO. If you can hive off a territory that is part of NATO without the consent of its people, be they Danes or Greenlanders, then you can do it anywhere in the world. And at that point, NATO becomes obsolete and it implodes, because NATO was created to protect members of this alliance that we are part of against, for instance, Russia coming for a country that is part of NATO. It was never designed for having one of its main members, the United States, going after the territory of another member. It just kills any sense that this military alliance makes any sense anymore. I understand that we are not there, and it will take a while, but everyone has noticed that the Canadian reaction to the Venezuela event has been a lot more muted than the comments on Greenland on the part of Prime Minister Carney, which makes total sense in the sense that the notion that you can come and pick a part of a country against the will of its people or its national government is something that hits close to home in this country, where we have two provinces that actually want to have referendums for different reasons in the future over leaving the Canadian Federation. And me, when I look at this, and I set aside the normal worry, and yes, I have to say that, like Bruce, I've noticed that it's not just us. The level of concern has risen in Canada this week. People are paying attention, as they were paying attention to the 51st state thing. They haven't, many people had gone back to their daily lives and figured Mark Carney will handle whatever happens on the trade front. And this is where we are. We are basically back to last January in the sense of, where is this going? But my concern is not that the US will suddenly come and seize the Great Lakes tomorrow, or run the oil industry that is actually flowing mostly their way at this point. My concern is and in particular, what may be coming up in Alberta, the referendum on possibly independence in Alberta, which I, like most Albertans, do not expect for a second to yield a yes vote, except that the dynamics of this expectation is that people sometimes use those exercises to send a message. And so the numbers for the yes side go up because it's a risk-free way to vent against the federal government. That number provides a basis for someone like Trump to say, look, 1 in 3 Albertans wants to leave this dreadful country, Canada. We would be happy to embrace them. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but I'm saying it's going to make governing Canada and keeping the Federation together a lot harder. Add to that the fact that Alberta is home to the largest number, and Bruce can tell me if I'm wrong, but to the largest number of voters who believe that Trump is doing a good job. And the home to the largest number of voters who actually believe that Alberta might be better off as part of the US. And what you have is the ingredient of a very different debate than the one on Greenland, military force in Venezuela, but that also makes 2026 a very crucial year for Canada. Let me just add to this the notion that there's been some reporting on it. I believe that there will be more, that there is some American money funding some of those independence movements in the prairies. And that kind of, when you look at the big picture, it is a troubling thing. And I am totally, when I say this, distinguishing what may or what is happening in Quebec and the Quebec debate over independence from what is happening in Alberta. I believe that people want to set them side by side and say, we have brothers in arms for sovereignty, are totally missing the fundamental differences between the two of them. I'm also not sure that the Trump administration would really want Quebec and all the trouble that would come with it.
Let me pick up on a couple of points before I get Bruce to weigh back in again. You're quite right about the democracy word post-Venezuela. I don't think it was ever been uttered by Trump since the point that the commandos dropped into the presidential palace. I don't think he's ever mentioned democracy once. In fact, I can't remember the last time he mentioned democracy at all anyway. It's just not part of his vocabulary. You're concerned that that Canada doesn't panic, I think is one most people could agree to. Panic is not a good strategy. The question is, what is the strategy? What is the strategy now in light of what happened last week? Does it change? The focus seems to have changed, as Chantal suggests, that we've sort of gone from trade to a very different kind of question about the relationship and how we prepare for it. Mm-hmm. But in terms of strategic moves or strategy in general, is there a sense of what the strategy is or what it should be at this point, Bruce?
Yeah, I do think that there is, and I agree that the prudent strategy, the prudent approach for Canadian political leaders is not to enlarge the dimension of the issue for the sake of some sort of political advantage near term. There is a duty of care associated with that role of prime minister right now that is, I think, higher than I have seen in decades, perhaps in my life. People might argue there have been moments, referendum, that kind of thing, but to me, this is more serious. And the standard that a political leader should hold themselves to in terms of how they participate in this conversation is higher, should be more exacting. I want to pick up on, and I'm going to come back to your question about what is the right strategy, Peter, in a moment, but I want to pick up on what Chantal was saying about NATO, because I really agree with the point that she's making, which is that Greenland, it's not to diminish the importance of what's happened in Venezuela, but Greenland is a very different question for Canadians, for Canada, for what has traditionally been our most important set of military and diplomatic alliances. And what the White House is saying now is our first choice is always diplomacy, which is the same as saying if diplomacy doesn't work, if we can't buy it, we need it, so we'll take it. Those are very threatening assertions. They can sound benign if people are trying to kind of shield their sensibilities from, another shocking day, but they're not benign. And they're obviously not benign to Denmark and to Greenlanders. And I think other NATO members are taking note. I think it's a good thing. This kind of gets to strategy. What should we be doing? Well, we need to have lots of conversations with fellow travelers, like-minded countries. So it's good that we have a prime minister that's established lines of conversation and communication with those European partners. I think it's good that we're ramping up efforts to build stronger relations from a trade standpoint with China and with India. And the prime minister is going to China next week. I know there are some who are going to be anxious about what kinds of compromises might be involved in establishing stronger economic relationships with those two countries. And I think on the other side of that argument, we need to live in the world in which we live, which is a different one from what we might like. But the reality is that people in Canada have built an economy that does depend on a lot of trade with the world. And if trade is that disrupted, we need to be agile. We need to be thinking clearly about where the opportunities are. And we need a federal government that is actively looking to enlarge those opportunities for people, especially in the context of some that might be smaller because of actions by the United States. And the last thing I wanted to touch on is the referendum question. I think that to watch everything that the United States under Trump has done around the world, and to assume that they would not find some way to try to intervene in their own interests in our referendum conversations would be extraordinarily naive. I think it's time for us not to be naive about that. I think we should understand that whether it's done in an organized, sanctioned way, doesn't really matter. There will be a lot of stakeholders with money and with no real moral hesitation about the idea of intervening. And so, again, I think this raises the stakes for Canadian politicians who might have thought nurturing these ideas of a frustration with Canada, of frustration with the federal government, of maybe separatism itself. The consequences of doing that, to me, are greater now. The negative consequences are greater now than they have ever been. Chantal's right that there are more people in Alberta who think that Trump is a good president than there are anywhere else in the country. It's still not a huge number, but it's a number that's big enough to look kind of appealing to American stakeholders who might say there's a lot of resource there, and we really like kind of poking jurisdictions where we see the resource benefits and we can see ourselves destabilizing the political conversation, and we don't really care what it sounds like. That's obvious every day. We don't care if it sounds completely anathema to the relationship that we've had with the rest of the world or Canada for forever. Sometimes we just think that that's good because it signals to this base that you don't have to talk about the Epstein files. You can talk about this, and you can see our muscularity in this area. So I think we can't afford to be naive. And I think that all federal politicians really need to take the measure of the seriousness of the moment and think about how they would have a conversation about referendums in the context of, is this a moment where we want to fire up people to say, do I like Ottawa well enough? Do I think the federal government is good enough to my province? That conversation is legitimate. This is a democracy. We have the means to have that conversation. No argument there. But I think voters are going to want to hold leaders to a standard that's different, federal leaders especially, but probably provincial leaders as well, to a standard that's different. Because this isn't a political science exercise that we're talking about. This has the potential, this set of circumstances in the world right now has the potential to create very serious social and economic consequences for our country well into the future.
You wanted to pick up on that,
Yeah,
Chantal.
I just want to add one thing to Bruce's contention that to believe that the only countries in the world that would want to interfere in our politics would be India and China, and the US would never want to do that. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I also don't believe in coincidences. And it has struck me at year's end that two of the main demands of the US administration to renegotiate CUSMA are getting rid of the cultural sovereignty issue and supply management, which happen to be two of the main pressure points policy-wise in Quebec specifically. You can believe in accidents and say these are major irritants, they have been forever, but it does totally play to the notion that there will be a Quebec election, and those trade renegotiations, if they involve concessions that touch nerves in Quebec, will reinforce the sovereigntist narrative that why would you want to stay in a country that negotiates on your back when you can try to negotiate for yourself? You can do worse than having Ottawa negotiate for you. So I think that there is a calculation behind those demands that goes beyond traditional irritants and that are part of a larger picture. I'm not saying people are sitting in the Oval Office every day scheming to see how they can break up Canada. I believe there's no attention span on the part of this administration that is long enough for that. But I would still be paying attention to all those signals.
You think there's, last year, early 25, when Trump took over, there was this sense in Canada that there needed to be some kind of unified pull organized in such a way as to present a common front against the U.S. on the trade issue. It was toyed with for a while, kind of fell apart, didn't really last. Is this different now? Should parties be considering, if everyone's worried, if there is deemed to be a serious threat, that there should be more of a unified front?
We shouldn't be negotiating against each other, and we did not in the last instance, in a more normal setting. Who thought we would refer to Trump first version as a more normal setting? I have found, to tell you the truth, the premiers to be relatively well behaved while holding their ground on issues that are of interest to them. And I'm talking here about Premier Ford and the auto industry, Saskatchewan and canola, Alberta and oil, BC and the environment. Despite that, they are still talking. They're not at war with each other, but you can't force premiers to suddenly go against the interest of the people who elect them. And we are going to see some of that when the Prime Minister goes to China. Beyond the unease over getting closer to China, which I totally understand, there will be this notion that he could get a deal on canola if only he dropped tariffs on e-vehicles, which Ontario would probably say, what are you trying to do? Don't we have enough trouble with the auto industry without you doing this? So at some point, I'm all for people showing a united front, but I am not going to start demanding of the Premier of Quebec that he doesn't defend the interest of the voters of his province. Same with BC, same with Alberta. That would make the federation what? The dream of those who see it as a unitary state with a senior government sitting in Ottawa, and it couldn't work over time.
Peter, for me, the first question is, and it goes to this idea of how much reaction is too much. Is it too optimistic to believe that sometime in the next 12 months, America, the sane part of America, the kind of the stability-loving part of America, will grab the wheel of its politics and tame or contain some of these really kind of gross expressions of muscularity. I think that's possible. I think I've become less optimistic about it with the passage of time, perhaps especially this week, just watching the events in Minneapolis and realizing just how impossibly divided America seems to be when it kind of sees events unfold and people are called upon to react. But so I'm less optimistic about it, but I wouldn't say that it's impossible. There are, structures and people and organizations in the United States for whom the destabilizing effects of what the Trump administration is doing are quite disconcerting. They've just been rather quiet so far, and maybe that will change. And maybe it'll change because the extent of the disruption is growing. Maybe it'll change because the political dynamics around midterm elections are becoming, nearer. But we should assume that is one way in which some of these pressures will dissipate. And so we shouldn't assume that America will never find its way back to something that feels more normal. I say that with a great deal of hesitation right now, but I think that's still possible. What else we can do, though, I think, is this diversification, relationship building. But to Chantal's point, the relationship with the premiers is in remarkably good shape right now. That's on them, and it's on the prime minister. Together, they're going to have a meeting, I guess, coming up in, 2 weeks, perhaps? I think that the frequency of these conversations is really good. I think the degree to which they've stopped being platforms for political aggression against each other is really remarkable. And I don't think it's just a function of the threat from the United States. I think there's been effort put in around that table to have conversations that are more productive. I think we need to have that. I think the fact that the action in Venezuela is clearly putting a spotlight again on the pipeline question, but that we haven't seen an explosion of, obviously we see Premier Eby talking about maybe a refinery, not a pipeline. And we see Pierre Poilievre talking about we need that pipeline, and Danielle Smith too. But there's a level of acrimony in that is lower than might have been expected, given the strength of the politics around those issues in the past. I think that's helpful as well. So in the end, I think we are still holding together better than might have been expected, and the size of the challenge having grown bigger, I completely agree with Chantal, is testing that. And so far, I think we're passing that test in terms of the ability to kind of stay pointed in the right general and the same general direction.
All right. We're going to take our break. And both of you have mentioned China a couple of times, and as one of you mentioned, Prime Minister's heading off to China next week. So I want to talk about that. But we'll take our first break, and we'll be right back after this.
Across Canada, a new economy is taking shape. Built by Canadians everywhere. People like you. Building with Canadian-made materials. Delivering cleaner electricity. Powering breakthroughs in AI and clean tech. Adding new customers for our resources, like critical minerals and cleaner steel. Selling Canadian know-how around the world. Canada's new economy. Innovative, competitive, cleaner, stronger.
Welcome back. Peter Mansbridge here, along with Chantal Hébert and Bruce Anderson. This is your Friday Good Talk. You're listening on Sirius XM, Channel 167, Canada Talks, or on your favorite podcast platform, or you're watching us on our YouTube channel. Glad to have you with us. Whatever venue you have chosen to monitor us on. Okay. China. When these trips take place, when the leader of one country goes to visit another country, there's a lot of pre-work done. And sometimes there are deals made in that pre-work by officials, Sherpas or whatever they call them. And it becomes a kind of signing ceremony when the actual leaders get together. Now, the Prime Minister has met President Xi, a month or so ago at one of the South Asian or APEC country meetings in I think it was in Korea. So they had their kind of initial discussions. They seemed to go well. Anita Anand has been to China, the foreign minister. So I don't know what, if anything, has already been agreed to in terms of what may happen next week when the Prime Minister goes there, but I'm sure he's not just going out of the blue thinking, gee, it'd be nice to have a chat with President Xi. Something must be going on. But how extensive it is, how important it is, I guess we're about to find out. Who knows what about Carney's visit to China? Why don't you start?
I'm not convinced by your sense that a lot of groundwork is being put into this to get the actual real takes over the course of that visit, because I don't believe the relationship is at that level. We are trying to restart something. And you are suggesting, I'm caricaturing here, you're suggesting that someone's going to show up with the ring and make a proposal. And I don't think we are at that stage. We are basically seeing if we want maybe to date again, and it would be a very dry date. Because remember, people keep talking about 2017 when Justin Trudeau showed up. And yes, there were deliverables that had been discussed ahead of time, and they never happened. Right? That visit was a failure on that front. In the end, there was not enough common ground for something to happen. But the freezing of the relationship between China and Canada does not date back to that visit. It dates back to the day when Jean Chrétien retired. Stephen Harper came to government wanting to put a lot more distance between the government of Canada and China than his Liberal predecessor. You wouldn't have seen him lead a Team Canada visit. Boy, that sounds like something from another era, and it is, to China to sign loads of contracts. We're not back there in any way, shape, or form. The United States take on this, and that's not just a Trump thing, has changed dramatically since those days. And Canadian public opinion, frankly, is a lot more skeptical about the spectacle of the Prime Minister making deals with the Chinese government, given everything that's happened over the past decade, the two Michaels, the foreign influence assertions, go down the list. So I think there is more to this visit than just Prime Minister Carney on his way to Davos in Switzerland wants to go to China and see his vis-a-vis. But it's more the start of something rather than the final seal on a lot of preparations that will resolve in deliverables. I think that's going to take a while. I also think that the Prime Minister will have, one, to convince public opinion that this is really promising at this point, but two, he's going to have to juggle the canola versus EVs issue big time, because if there is a deliverable that people will expect in an important section of the country, it's going to be something on canola. But that would be like removing obstacles to a better, more constructive relationship rather than moving on to the building blocks of that relationship.
Okay, but it would be no small thing if something like that happened.
Well, if it's on the back of the auto industry, it would be, yes. I don't think there would be a big welcome committee in Ottawa from the Ontario government if that happens. It's complicated.
Okay, and just to defend myself, I never suggested that there was going to be a lot of stuff. I suggested in the past these things kind of worked out that way. But,
but
I hear what you're saying, and I don't disagree with.
But the last time that happened was before Stephen Harper became prime minister. Right. Is my point.
Back to the days of Chrétien riding the bicycle up the Great Wall of China, or that kind of stuff. So maybe we'll see Carney doing that next week. Bruce, what do you? Where do you sit on this?
Quite similar to Chantal on a number of points. I think
Oh, sure.
He's not ganging up on you.
But I didn't interpret her comments as being slamming your observations or anything, Peter. They were just like, they sat alongside your comments.
Exactly. Thank you. I did say I was caricaturing when I talked about the ring and the proposal.
Look, I think the China situation is obviously complicated, not just by the events of the last 10, 15, 20 years, but by the events of the last 10 days. This is a moment where I think we really need to be aware of the temptation to want the world to be simpler. Like it is better if you can get up in the morning these days and go, this is simple. Let's just get these two leaders together and it'll establish some positive chemistry. And then the trade will flow the way we want to imagine it. It will flow and nothing bad can happen from that. But if we step back from that kind of optimistic, bounce out of bed feeling happier for a change stance, and we say, well, what is the likelihood that China is watching what the U.S. is doing in Venezuela and taking the measure of what license that gives them in relationships around the world, including obviously in most particularly in respect of Taiwan? So the Canadian government needs to occupy a place that is both protective of our moral values, but very thoughtful about our economic context. And that's not easy. It's easy to say. It's really, really difficult to do. The one thing that I don't, and I didn't hear Chantal say exactly this, but others do, and I don't always find myself agreeing with it, is how much impatience Canadians have or don't have for some sort of silver bullet moment, some sort of sense of a breakthrough that will make the world stable again. I think people want that because it's natural to want that, but I think that they stopped thinking that it was possible sometime last year in respect of the United States. And the events of the last little while will kind of further cement the notion that this isn't one guy doing two or three really difficult things. This is the whole world getting thrown into disarray. And watching, for example, the way that the UK Prime Minister is reacting to this is for anybody who's doing that is going to be destabilizing as well, because you're going to think, well, hang on a second. Is there a common perspective? Does everybody who used to be aligned kind of see this in the same way, see their interests in the same way? Are we going to work towards the same set of outcomes? And I think those questions are bigger, broader, and more perplexing than they were. Instead, I think public opinion is in a battle right now between the instinct to despair and the desire to hope. And despair is winning a lot of days, especially with people under a certain age who think that the piling on of the risks to their economic well-being, their sense of social security and well-being, peace in the world even, that those risks are piling up. That isn't the same as saying then they look to a government, federal, provincial, or anything else, and say, please solve that, or you must solve that, or I'll vote for somebody else if you don't solve that. That can happen, but that isn't what we see right now. Instead, we have people kind of feeling this sense of perpetual, sustained, heightened anxiety. And it's in that context, again, where the duty of care of our political leaders is to not give people false hope, but to help them manage that sense of despair and fear about the amount of disruption and risk that lies ahead. And that is absolutely not easy. And as it relates to China or the United States or India or the future of NATO, it's not going to be solved in one meeting. It's not going to be solved in 1 year. It's an ongoing kind of, we've got to renew our relationships with the rest of the world while the rest of the world is changing on the fly.
I really yeah, go ahead, Chantal.
I just wanted to mention there is a big difference between the last time we seriously engaged with China, which would be the Chrétien era, and today. And that is that back then, the rationale, I've always found it very opportunistic, to tell you the truth, was that the more the West engaged with China, the more it would move towards democracy. I think in this round, we can go in this attempt at restarting the relationship with our eyes wide open and do away with the pretext that we are actually helping democracy by engaging China, because clearly that theory has been debunked. It was convenient to give some impetus to those Team Canada trips, but here we are some decades later. It's not too early to draw conclusions on the value of that. So let's agree that we are talking with China for our own self-interest, but we are not doing it as democracy builders in China. That is not only presumptuous, but it's not going to be happening.
That's a good reminder to give us. It's so bang on. By the way, see that Chrétien, even, what is he now, 91? Somewhere in there. He was in China again.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It never stops. It's like the, what is it, the energy?
We didn't talk about the one other aspect, and it doesn't really connect to anything, but, well, it does. The U.S. yesterday announced that they were withdrawing from 66 different international organizations. And the scale of that move towards isolationism is really important. It's easy for it to get lost in all of the other shocking things that happen. But it's a very significant signal that if we're going to be involved in a conversation about climate change, for example, we're not going to be involved in that conversation with the United States anymore, or at least as long as Donald Trump is in office. In the global energy marketplace, nobody is doing more to accelerate the lowering of the cost of renewable energy than China. You could make a very strong case that everything that America is doing under Trump right now is cementing a poor trajectory for America in terms of its energy policy, including Trump saying yesterday that his goal is to reduce the price of fossil fuels. All of those companies that he's saying are going to invest billions of dollars, they're not in it. They're not in that conversation with the hope that the price of oil will come down. But to the extent that America says it's only drill, baby, drill, it's not drill, baby, drill, and let's build up our capacity in renewable energy. They seem to be saying that because it feels like a kind of a MAGA moment. It feels like a MAGA theme, kind of a return to an earlier simple time before the woke got hold of the reins of power and turned our country into a mess. That it fits that narrative, but it's a terrible economic proposition, especially given what China is doing. And Canada is going to want to have a policy around climate change. And I watched the Prime Minister talk about the competitiveness of our conventional energy, our oil, the other day. And he said, our place is to be low cost, low risk, and low carbon. And what he meant by low risk is a stable place that you can do business with. I thought that was a really important point. And of course, we do have a relatively low cost oil because our companies have invested a lot in learning how to do this better and better over the years. So sorry to take us off. I know you wanted to kind of move to a new topic, but I felt like we need to mention that climate issue.
All good stuff. And, you know, speaking of the oil price, I mean, it is low right now. Anybody who's bought gas at the gas station knows that it's low, even in the last couple of weeks. It's so low that for a lot of oil companies, it's right at that borderline. It goes any lower, it's not good enough to move ahead with projects because they're going to lose money on them. And God forbid oil companies should lose money. Okay, we're going to take our final break, come back, talk about Chrystia Freeland. We've only got a few minutes to do that, but we will do it right after this.
After more than 2 decades as a journalist with CTV News asking the questions, I'm now helping clients answer them. I work with CEOs, associations, unions, building confidence and helping them prepare for everything from media interviews to board presentations. It comes down to being authentic, engaging, and relatable, because it's more than just what you say, but how you say it. So let's talk.
Final segment of Good Talk for this week. Bruce, Chantel, Peter, all in the house. Chrystia Freeland steps away today, I guess, from Ottawa for real now. And she's taking up a job with Zelensky in Ukraine. What's the footnote here for Chrystia Freeland, who had one of the highest ranking portfolios in the Trudeau government, was pretty much the person who plunged the knife into Trudeau at the end. And in spite of a long-term relationship with Mark Carney, that didn't work out in the long term in terms of her positioning in the federal cabinet. But anyway, whatever the case, she's gone now. What does it tell us? Chantel, and I'm sorry, we do only have a few minutes, but go ahead.
Okay, a few points. I think looking back with time, she's had a good run in politics. And yes, she did have a variety of roles, including a central role in the renegotiation of CUSMA under the first Trump administration. It's a voluntary position that she's taking with Ukraine. It's not a paid job. The paid job comes in July, and it was already announced with the Rhodes Foundation. So basically, that she is leaving the House of Commons is not a surprise. The only question was the date. It does set in motion inevitably a by-election. The Prime Minister this week talked about by-elections in the plural. So I expect others, maybe on the Liberal bench, to move on to other challenges, maybe on the diplomatic front. And that means Mark Carney has to decide. He's got 6 months to call by-elections. They will be a test of his first year in government whenever he calls them. Does he do so quickly so that he has the votes for whatever confidence votes come his way in the spring? I understand totally from various sources that his preference would have been for Ms. Freeland to stick around in her seat until the spring. And that's confirmed by the traditional 3 sources. But that's not happening. So he's got a choice of calling them quickly, appointing whoever he appoints, and filling those seats, or waiting and doing without those 2-3 votes that could be crucial. If I were sitting in the PMO, and thank God I am not, I would go for the early scenario. And Freeland's seat is a quote-unquote safe Liberal seat in theory. But in the not-so-old days, Olivia Chow was elected in a section of that riding. And so there is NDP territory there. She's now the mayor of Toronto. And the name that is going around for the NDP, that's not confirmed in any way, shape, or form, is Mike Layton, Jack Layton's son. Now, if I heard these rumors and I was Mark Carney, I would want to have that by-election before the NDP has a permanent leader in March. One, for reasons of filling the vacancies. Lots of people are interested to run for the Liberals in University Rosedale, but also because there is a possibility that the NDP under a new leader could find momentum in having a strong candidate. Mike Layton used to be a municipal politician in Toronto. He has seen since stopped being in politics, but if he does run, he will be a strong contender for that seat. I'm not saying he's going to win, but he could pull some of that vote, 64%. By the way, Chrystia Freeland, in the last election, for the first time in her riding, the NDP ran third. and not second. And what does that say? That a lot of NDP members voted for her. So if they start going home, it doesn't mean the Liberals lose the seat, but it means the score is not as great as it used to be.
Bruce, you have 2 minutes on this, if you want.
First thing, I think for Ms. Freeland, I agree with Chantal that she had a very successful career in politics in terms of the contributions that she was given an opportunity to make. The last year has been kind of a very disrupted year for her, obviously, in terms of the leadership race and the relationship that she had with Justin Trudeau. But she made a contribution to Mr. Carney's cabinet, and she did her work, I think, diligently and without any kind of rancor or anything like that. I think she's shown a remarkable passion to try to help deal with the Ukraine situation over a number of years. And she's been a real thought leader and activist on that issue. So it's not surprising to me that when she was asked if she would take on a voluntary role to help advise the Ukrainian government on economic matters, that she said yes. I know some people were remarking about how it was a conflict. And, perhaps there's a little bit of sloppiness there in terms of the timing, but it never really struck me as being one of those, kind of unbelievable things that people sometimes can get riled up about it, because it was a volunteer thing. It was an extension of her passion to help Ukraine. But we are where we are now. And I think the path ahead is one where I happen to think that Mr. Carney and his party is in pretty good shape, relatively speaking. I mean, public opinion polls can sort of show that Conservatives and Liberals are kind of close together, but it comes down to which party do you want to have leading the country. That's not that close, and it's not that close because Carney is seen as a much more appealing leader for this moment than Pierre Poilievre is. Whether or not we end up in a situation where the mood of the House is to keep on threatening to have an election, and whether we end up having an election as opposed to a series of by-elections, I think is an open question.
All right.
And I think
You sound like you're getting ready for a campaign, so we'll keep that in mind.
I don't think that's the preference. I think it's more a question of, how will this dynamic unfold? Because Pierre Poilievre really talks about he wants to have an election, and he'll presumably get a mandate from his party to pursue that in a couple of weeks.
We'll talk about that more in the next couple of weeks. I'm going to close out this way. I always like to look for a line, and both of you are so good at coming up with lines. I'm going to give Bruce the line of the show this week, and I'm going to use it in the titling of the show. Despair versus hope. That's what we're looking at in so many cases right now in the country on so many different issues, especially in the last week. Despair versus hope, and despair is winning. That was the line. We'll use that for titling this show today. Thank you both.
Sounds like it's going to make people really joyful.
Oh, they'll watch.
Yeah.
They'll listen. They'll watch. Thank you both. Have a great weekend. We'll talk to you again next week.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.